My son came home from school, terrified, saying a boy was following him, so I went to that boy's house at midnight and dug up the secret his family was hiding. My son staggered into the kitchen and dropped his backpack on the floor like someone punched him. He was shaking and said a boy from school had been following him for weeks. I grabbed him and asked questions, and he could barely get the words out. He said the boy waited for him after class, watched him at lunch, and once walked behind him for half a mile. I called the school first thing the next morning, and they acted like this was normal kid stuff. They said they'd talked to teachers and counselors and asked us to file an incident report online. The report was a form letter and a checkbox. It made me mad because my kid had been scared for weeks and the school treated it like a paper problem. So I went to pick my son up after school myself that day and waited outside the door. The boy showed up and stood near the bike racks, eyes on my son like he was deciding something. I followed at a distance when they left. He didn't turn down the path home. He followed my son the whole way. I called my husband while we walked and told him to meet us at the house. He said, "Call the police." I hung up and kept following. The boy finally split off and went into a small duplex on our block. I memorized the address and went home with my son, shaking under my coat. My husband wanted to involve cops. I didn't want my son to be forced to relive it with uniforms right away. We agreed the police would be next if the school didn't do anything, but I needed answers sooner. That night I checked the duplex from across the street. A light was on in the basement and the curtains were always closed. Neighbors were guarded when I asked about the family. They shrugged and said they kept to themselves. But one older woman said the family rarely left the house. I learned the boy's name and that his family had been renting the place for years. The owner of the duplex told me the kids were quiet and paid late sometimes. My son kept sleeping with the light on and refusing to walk to school alone. Every time the boy appeared on the sidewalk, my chest got tight like something old and wrong was happening again. Things started getting worse when the school sent another canned email saying they were monitoring. The word monitoring felt like a joke when my kid couldn't even walk to a bus stop. I decided I couldn't wait for the system. I drove to the duplex around midnight. I parked a few houses down and walked up the side yard. My hands were shaking, but I kept going. The backyard gate was unlatched like someone expected company at weird hours. I climbed through and crouched by a raised flower bed that had been dug up recently. My shovel was in the trunk because I told myself I'd plant bulbs the next morning. I used it instead. I started digging near a patch of disturbed earth. It didn't take long before metal hit the blade. I found a small metal box wrapped in black plastic. My heart hammered. I carried the box to the trunk and opened it on the tailgate under the streetlight. Inside was a stack of passports, altered school IDs, and a pile of hospital discharge papers with different names. The IDs had photos of the same boy and of other kids. The passports had stamps from states we didn't live in. There were photocopies of custody documents with redactions and handwriting that didn't match any local social worker. There was a bank deposit slip with a cash amount that made no sense for a small family. I took photos of everything with my phone and texted them to my husband and the school resource officer I knew. I told them to come now. I heard a car pull into the driveway. Footsteps on the back porch sounded like someone moving fast. I stuffed the documents back into the box and shoved it under my jacket. I waited behind the shrubs. The back door opened and two adults came out arguing. One of them barked orders and the other muttered something I couldn't hear. Then a kid's voice called from upstairs. The man slammed the door and went back inside like he had been telling the kids to keep quiet. My husband and the school resource officer pulled up and I stepped out. I told them what I found and showed them the photos. The officer's face changed. He said he needed to call his sergeant and not to move anything. He asked me where I'd dug and I pointed. He called for backup. 2 patrol cars showed in minutes. Officers moved to the front and back of the duplex quietly. They knocked at the door and announced themselves, and the argument inside died. They made the parents step outside. I kept my distance because I didn't want the kids to see me like I was performing. But I watched the father and mother through the porch slats. They were nervous and flustered, and the mother kept wiping her hands on her jeans. The officer asked for name and ID, and the father gave a fake name that didn't match the lease. The backup officer shined a flashlight into the windows and saw a locked bedroom door with a small padlock. That was when they asked the mother to open the door. She fumbled with the key and it stuck and didn't turn right away. The officers had to pry the door open. Inside was a small room with bunk beds, toys, a laptop, and a wall calendar covered in stickers. On the floor lay a pile of backpacks, and under one backpack a pair of children's shoes that were dusty. Another officer found a closet with a false back, and behind it were file folders. He brought them out and laid them on the lawn. I heard my son's name on someone's radio and my whole body stopped. One of the folders had a report with his school listed as a contact and a line of handwriting. Monitor pickup. The lead detective told me to sit in his car. My husband got in the passenger seat and I handed him my phone that had the photos. A detective stayed on the porch with the family and the other officers went inside. The mother was hysterical and the father looked ancient with guilt, like he had been caught doing something he'd spent years hiding. They found stamped and folded envelopes in the trash with children's hospital labels and different names. They found receipts for cash paid to people for temporary custody transfers. The detective called it smuggling. He said they were taking kids off the radar, getting fake IDs, selling fingerprints for adoption brokers. I felt like I couldn't breathe. My body went hot and cold at once. They brought the kids out one by one. There were 4 kids, all smaller than my son, looking terrified and thin and wearing clothes that were either too big or too small. One of them saw me and started crying and hid behind an officer. They called a Child Protective Services van. The father kept saying he was trying to help and he was protecting the kids and he had been doing it for 10 years. The detective asked him how many kids and he hesitated like he forgot. They opened more closets and cupboards and found more IDs and more passports. Under a loose floorboard in the basement, they found a box of cash and a ledger with names and dates. The ledger had amounts next to names and notes that said, meet in parking lot, exchange at rest stop, no questions. It had bank deposit numbers and phone numbers that matched burner phones. I asked why any parent would do this, and the mother sobbed she didn't know how to feed her own kids, and it started as a favor and then it turned into business. The father clutched his face and said he had been promised money to hold children temporarily for families who needed quiet solutions. They read a statement that said a couple had paid them monthly to look after a child and bring a passport when needed. My hands would not stop shaking. The detective said the boy who followed my son had been used to scout eligible kids who looked timid or who had good school records. They would groom them and then move them out. I thought of my son walking behind that kid every day, scared and alone, and I felt furious and raw. I wanted to go up to the father and shove him and tell him what he stole, but the officers were doing the work I had no right to do, and they handled it clean and sharp. They took pictures, read documents, cuffed the adults, and called for child services transport. The next day, the news came to our block, and neighbors watched as vans left with kids in the back being quiet. Reporters called me for a comment, and I said nothing beyond the basics because the kids' names were confidential. The school suspended the boy for harassment and notified police again, but the bigger case had just exploded. A task force formed, and the city started digging into adoption brokers and fake custody rings. I stayed with my son for a week. He slept only when I was in the room. He had nightmares about being followed and about strangers taking kids. He clung to me at night and refused to go outside alone. The detective called and said they'd traced several payments to a private mailbox service and a storage unit. He asked if I wanted to testify in person about how my son was followed. I said yes immediately. He said the father had confessed to facilitating sales and the mother admitted to forging documents. Then the escalation came when the sergeant told me another address popped up. They found a van with cages in it and shipping labels going to other states. They were arresting people across 3 states. They found families who had paid to quietly rehome kids when they couldn't afford them, or when they wanted to hide custody from an abusive partner. My stomach turned, thinking that some of the kids in the files were missing children from other towns. They started cross-referencing missing person reports. One afternoon, a woman I had never met knocked on my door. She introduced herself as a foster mom from 3 counties over and said one of the passports in the box matched a child who had been reported missing 2 years ago. Her voice was shaking when she said that she had reported her granddaughter missing and was told they had no leads. She had spent nights wandering hospitals and shelters and been told it was a dead end. The detective told me later that the operation had been bigger than they first thought. The ledger had code names and locations and even an entry that matched a missing person ID. They issued a press release asking anyone who had ever been told to temporarily house a child to come forward. The phones lit up with tips. Among the tips were emails with scanned receipts and videos that matched faces in the passports. One caller provided a bank transfer that paid a family to take a toddler for safekeeping during a divorce. The city prosecutor called the ring trafficking. They used words like conspiracy and interstate criminal activity. My son went to counseling and I went to meetings with other parents. We learned how traffickers groom people who are desperate and how they abuse small systems of trust. One of the boys in the case, the one who had followed my son, sat in a juvenile room with a counselor. He confessed he thought he was helping families and that he didn't mean harm. He said the man paid him pizza and a little cash to bring kids to the house. He was 15 and scared and finally admitting it. My son watched the court hearing from behind a glass wall. He didn't need to testify because the father had confessed, but he sat there and wept quietly. The judge sentenced the couple to prison on multiple counts and ordered restitution. They banned them from any contact with children for life. The prosecutor told me the passports and fake papers had prevented some kids from being reunited sooner. Hundreds of records and a network of buyers were still under investigation. 2 months later, the detective called with news that changed everything again. They had matched DNA from a school record to a missing girl who had been thought dead. She had been living under a different name in another state. A family had bought papers and raised her for years until a dispute led the seller to move the child. When her biological family saw her on video, they couldn't believe it and flew across the country. The reunion was messy and emotional, and the local paper ran the story, and then national outlets picked it up. I watched a clip where the girl's aunt hugged her and told her she had wanted her home for 10 years. I thought of the metal box in my hands and how a shovel had pulled their truth out of the dirt. People asked what happened to the kids who had been taken through our block. Child Services said many were placed with relatives or into protective custody, and the older ones were entering programs. The boy who followed my son went into juvenile diversion, community service, and therapy. He was a victim and an accomplice both. Our family kept living, but anything that felt normal was strange now. We couldn't unsee the ledger or the passports. Months later, the city held a hearing and the prosecutor read names of families implicated. There was an apology from an official who said systems had failed. Neighbors who had ignored signs started telling their stories too. People had known something felt off but had shrugged because it was easier. I still checked our front yard at night. My son rode the bus alone again after we walked him 2 weeks, and I practiced letting go. The prosecutor came to thank me at court and said my digging made the whole ring vulnerable. If I hadn't found that box, the ledger might never have surfaced. I felt a weird pride that was tangled with sick relief and anger. I had broken a kind of quiet complicity by doing something ugly and illegal myself, but it worked. There were news interviews and a quiet meeting with school officials where they said they'd change procedures. They created a safer route program and added an anonymous tip line. My son kept drawing at the kitchen table for weeks. He drew places where he felt safe and places he didn't. One of the other parents sent a letter thanking me because they had a child child who recovered a missing cousin. She wrote that I had pulled a thread that unraveled something awful. Sometimes I felt guilty for sitting in a car at midnight with a shovel while another parent had saved photographs and memories. But I also felt like a parent who had nothing to lose. A year after that night, the detectives closed the main case. Convictions were secured and several families were reunited. The city started an awareness campaign about illegal custody and adopting off the books. They put flyers in clinics and shelters, and the community finally had words for what had happened. My son still flinched sometimes when someone came too close. He got better with time and a counselor who taught him ways to feel safe. People asked me if I regretted digging. I said I regretted the need to do it, but I didn't regret finding the truth. At night, sometimes I thought about the kids in those shaky bunk beds and the ledger filled. I couldn't get their faces out of my head. Months later, I drove past the duplex and the lawn was empty and weeded. A for sale sign hung crookedly on the porch. The investigation led to stricter laws and more checks at child services. They closed loopholes that made temporary custody an easy ticket for criminals. I still don't know how to feel about everything that happened. But the kids got names back. The kids got home, and the secret in the backyard was finally unburied.